Hello, history nerds and historians. My name is Krystina, and this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history that's super fucked up. Today is number 5 of the Tudor series, where we'll be focusing on the wives of Henry VIII, and then, some other stuff after we're finished talking about them. So we have talked about Katherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, and now we are talking about wife number 5, Katherine Howard. I honestly think that this one might be the saddest for me, and it might be the one that makes me the most angry. So, yeah, trigger warning, death, brief mention of miscarriage, torture. I got my coffee. I've got a cold. I've got my existential dread. I got my big feelings on. Let's do this. Without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your oh good God, what the fuck faces. So Katherine Howard was most likely born 1522 or 1523. Some sources say as late as 1524, but most historians believe 1522 to 1523 in Lambeth in England. Her mother was Jocasta Culpeper, and her father was Lord Edmund Howard. He was the son of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, which was the man who led Catherine's of Aragon's army in the Battle of Flodden. So we've talked about him a couple times. He was a super cool dude. We like Thomas Howard, although Thomas Cranmer did not like Thomas Howard, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Her mother Jocasta had 5 children from her first marriage, and then 6 more with Catherine's father. 11 children, which is a preschool classroom. Yeah. Her grandmother was Elizabeth Tilney, who was the great aunt of Jane Seymour, which made Katherine and Jane second cousins. And her grandfather, being Thomas Howard, made Anne Boleyn, Katherine Howard's first cousin. So we're just keeping it all in the family with Henry VIII. After Katherine Howard's mother died, she and some of her siblings were sent to live at Chesworth House in Sussex with her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, which was Agnes Howard. She learned everything that she needed to know for court while she was here, and maybe a little more. I read that Agnes Howard was not there much. She spent a lot of time at court, and it seemed like Katherine didn't really have much guidance from adults, but she did have guidance from the girls and the other men around her. And apparently Catherine's grandmother's house was a pretty sexual place. In 1536, when Katherine was about 13 years old, she began music lessons with a man named Henry Mannix. There are some things that I've read that said this man was like in his mid to late 30s, but he was actually most likely in his like late teens to mid 20s. And while he was giving her music lessons, they began to have a consensual relationship. I mean, as consensual as it can be when you're 12 or 13. I know kids fool around. Like, I'm not naive or prude. And I know I shouldn't look at these historical figures in a modern lens, but I just can't get past the fact that, like, she was a child. And Henry Mannix is just the first of a slew of men who were significantly older than her, who were taking advantage of her. According to record, Mannix and Katherine exchanged letters, they exchanged gifts, they kissed and fondled each other. He said later he was attracted to her more than was convenient, but that they didn't know each other carnally. But she convinced a maid named Mary Lascelles to steal the key, and Mannix was not allowed in the room. Like, Katherine was done with Mannix, but other men were allowed in the room. But like, this was common at Chesworth. The girls all slept in a dormitory, essentially, together. They often shared beds with each other, and they would often, like, it wasn't just Katherine, like a lot of the girls would conveniently make the key disappear. And then men would come visit them at nighttime. Like, everyone was having sex. Katherine was not hypersexual. She was not, like, out of the normal. Like, people weren't appalled by her. Like, Chatsworth was just a very, very sexual place, apparently. And Katherine, having very little guidance from, like, a maternal figure, like her mother or grandmother or anything like that, like, just sort of, like, did what everyone else was doing, you know? In 1538, she began a relationship with Francis Derham. She was probably about like 15 or 16 at this time, as young as 14, as old as 16, most likely. They, unlike Mannix, did know each other carnally. They had a lot of sex, so much sex that the girl that shared her bed with her, like, complained and switched beds with someone else. How awkward. But their relationship seemed to only last like about 3 or so months. It ended when Mannix sent an anonymous letter to the Dowager Duchess that basically told her to, like, basically pretend to go to bed and then check on Katherine a half an hour or so after, and she would see what would displease her. So the relationship was discovered because Mannix is a petty bitch who can't, like, you know, get over the fact that he was broken up with. And the Dowager Duchess was worried that it would affect Katherine's looks. Like, she wasn't worried that it would, you know, that she would get pregnant. She wasn't worried that that this would be bad for her reputation or anything. She was like, if you fuck too many boys, you won't be pretty. You need to be pretty. So after this, Derham was sent to Ireland, where he apparently became a pirate. I want to research that more because I had to write like a research paper on pirates recently for one of the classes that I'm in, and they're extremely interesting. We're gonna talk about a pirate, I think, next month or July. Possibly I think in July, we're going to talk about some pirates. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, yeah, apparently he became a pirate, but possibly by Tudor standards, their relationship may have constituted a marriage. So they call each other husband and wife, and they consummated their relationship, which by Tudor standards was enough to be married. There didn't have to be like witnesses or anything. You didn't have to do it in front of a priest. If you made promises to each other and then consummated those promises, that was considered enough. And they may have done that. We'll talk about that a little bit more later when Katherine talks about their relationship in one of the letters that we have from her. But like, they may have done that. So yeah, even though Derham was sent away, he like left money with her and all of this, and they were like still writing a little bit, but she officially broke up with him in 1539 when she was chosen to be a maid of honor to Anne of Cleves. So at this point she was probably around 17 or so when she came to court and caught Henry's eye, who was 49. Henry saw Catherine Howard as like young and pure and virginal, and within months of arriving at court, Catherine Howard most likely became Henry's lover at 17 when he was 49. It's just, she's a child. Like, she's a child. He's almost triple her age. But, I mean, it was totally fine, I guess. So, he was recorded, like we kind of talked about briefly last time, taking trips to Catherine's house in the day and night. You know, we'll repeat what I said last time with Richard Hills, who reported courtiers first observed that he was much taken with another young lady, very small of stature, who he now has and whom he has seen crossing the Thames to visit, often in the day and sometimes at night, but it looked upon as a sign of adultery, not divorce. And adultery from a king is totally fine, but of course we know that the marriage with Anne of Cleves and Henry VIII did end in divorce. And then once Henry got serious about wanting to marry Katherine, he had to actually get dispensation to marry her because he was married to her cousin, Anne Boleyn. And also, don't forget, second cousin, Jane Seymour. On July 28th, 1540, Katherine and Henry married, and it was announced publicly on August 8th that she was the new queen consort. She was showered with jewels Apparently Henry's like sexual problems that he was having with Anne of Cleves, his impotency issues, like instantly disappeared with her. David Starkey, who is a historian, said sex was easy with Katherine because she made it easy, and Henry most likely lost in pleasure, never asked himself how she obtained such skill. Instead, he attributed all to love and his own recovered youth. They had a 10-day private honeymoon, and it was reported that he cannot treat her well enough and caresses her more than the others. That was said by Marillac, the French ambassador to Francis I of France. But soon after, rumors began to spread about Katherine and how such a young woman was apparently so skilled in her carnal affections. Like, where did she learn, apparently, to fuck so well? She's just like, some people are just naturals. She didn't tell anybody about her relationship with Derham and her relationship with Mannix or anything like that. She just like went to court and played the part of being like this pure virginal little girl. Young woman. And didn't tell anybody about her relationship because she was worried that it would like affect her standing. It was worried that it would give her a bad reputation or anything like that. And unfortunately, by keeping it a secret, it just like all came back to bite her in the ass. But Henry, at this point in time, after their marriage, was very happy. It was reported that Katherine was relatively carefree. She was too young to get involved with political matters because she's a child. There was no coronation date set for her at the time, but she was still recognized as the queen consort. If she were to have gotten pregnant, she probably would have been coronated. In April 1541, she apparently told the king that she was pregnant. It's unknown if she was like mistaken or if she lied about it or whether she was actually pregnant and had a miscarriage, but she never had any children on record, and they were married for a very short time. There were some possible jealousy issues around this time that she was exhibiting because there were rumors in court that Henry was regretting his marriage to Catherine Howard, that she was too young and that, you know, he wanted someone that was maybe a little bit more mature and that he was considering taking back Anne of Cleves. But like, there was no way that that was happening. Like he immediately squashed those rumors. And, you know, Anne of Cleves was his sister now, so that would be incest. And that's why we killed Anne Boleyn. Well, that's like one of the reasons why we killed Anne Boleyn. So, you know, yeah, I just so it said that Henry at the end of 1541, like into the summer, into the fall, was like very cranky and frustrated with his council, and that he regretted executing Cromwell, but like, you can't just like Frankenstein his head back on, you know, maybe we should not be so willy-nilly with the executions and like actually think things through. But this is Henry VIII that we are talking about, so that's definitely not what happens at all. On June 30th, 1541, Henry and Katherine began their trip to go see Henry's nephew, James V of Scotland, and he left Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Audley, and Edward Seymour in charge of his council, so like they were essentially running England while he was gone with Katherine. Katherine and Henry were planning to meet James in September, but it took a long time to travel, and they would like make some significant stops along the way, especially to, quote, emphasize the extent of his defeat of the Pilgrims from the Pilgrims of Grace, which we talked about in the Jane Seymour episode, and to humiliate utterly all but those most clearly loyal elements. During his trip, this is also where Catherine Howard began spending a lot of private time with a man named Thomas Culpeper, who was a member of Henry's privy chamber and was like very, very close to Henry, was a very trusted advisor to Henry. I feel like we have seen this all before with Anne Boleyn and Henry Norris and everything that happened with them. History does repeat itself. I just didn't think that it repeats itself so quickly in these cases. So apparently Katherine initiated contact with Culpeper on Maundy Thursday, 1541, which I read was April 14th. She gave him a cap and asked him to hide it under his cloak until he was in his room. And then when he became ill, she sent him meals, and they began meeting secretly in the summer of 1541 while they were traveling. It said that they would often be locked in a room together, just the two of them. And it's reported that Jane Boleyn, who was the widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother / Catherine's cousin, helped organize all of these meetings for them. And simultaneously, as all of this was happening, and Katherine may or may not have been meeting with Culpeper, Cranmer and other council members were first made aware that perhaps Katherine was like not as innocent as she portrayed herself to be. And Cranmer wanted to get rid of Katherine, not because he disliked her, like he didn't have any issues with her, but he disliked her grandfather, Thomas Howard, who was, like I said, the one who led the Battle of Flodden, and was also very, very Catholic. And Cranmer was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was like not wanting to have someone who was potentially Catholic on the throne. He wanted someone who was like very big with the Protestant Reformation, and he believed that King Henry should have a wife that would help the country go in the right direction, not possibly like back to the Catholic leanings. But I don't know if Catherine Howard was Catholic or if she cared. I mean, it didn't really talk anything about that. I'm assuming because her family was Catholic that there was like the worry that she was Catholic. But again, very little is written about Catherine Howard, so I can only make assumptions off of that. So they went and they did their trip. James V of Scotland actually like stood them up, which is ballsy of him, but also like I love that because I hate Henry VIII. And they made their way back to London, and by November they were back and everything was like, you know, up and running as normal. On November 2nd, 1541, when Henry was about 50 years old, he was heading into mass and found a letter from Thomas Cranmer sitting in like right next to where he would be. This letter claimed that Catherine Howard was not an innocent virgin, but had a dark and seedy past, that she had lived most corruptly and sensually. And he had gotten this information from Mary Hall, whose maiden name was Lascelles. This woman knew Katherine when she was with Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. She was the maid that stole the key for Katherine. She said that in 1536, Mary Hall said that she approached Mannix and warned him about his relationship with Catherine Howard and what that would mean for him. And he apparently replied, "Hold thy peace, woman. I know her well enough. My designs are of a dishonest kind, and from the liberties the young lady has allowed me, I doubt not of being able to effect my purpose. She had said to me that I shall have her maidenhead, though it be painful to her, and not doubting, but I will be good to her hereafter." Gross. Like, let's fixate on the virginity of a 12-year-old, right? You know, and that's like a really great accomplishment to be able to take her virginity for this man who was like, I mean, possibly double her age. Just delicious. Mary Hall also said that Mannix knew of a privy mark on Catherine's body. And then she also said that there's one Francis Derham, who was a servant also in my Lady Norfolk's house, which hath lain in bed with her, in his doublet and hose, between the sheets 100 nights. And there hath been such puffing and blowing between them, that once in the house a maid which lay there said that she lie no longer with her, because she knew not what matrimony meant. So that is referencing like that Katherine was apparently just like having so much sex with Derham that she was like annoying the people that she was sharing a room with. But again, this was not something that was uncommon. Like, the women that slept in this room together often did this with men from the court. Like, it wasn't something that Katherine just did. There were a lot of people who did this. When the king finished reading this letter and all of that, he was apparently like devastated. He allegedly just broke down in tears. Cranmer thought that he would be enraged, but he loved his child bride so much that, you know, he was just so heartbroken about this. The BBC documentary that I watched about the wives of Henry VIII had this like dramatic music, and Henry like drops to his knees as the music also drops, and it was very dramatic, which means I enjoyed it very much. And he was like, "No, my hot young teenage wife has seen another penis." Like, oh, this is terrible. It's awful. How will I ever survive? But Henry like actually kind of refused to believe these accusations. He still said that like they needed to conduct a secret investigation into it, again doing it behind her back, just like with Anne Boleyn, when he was just having all of these investigations done behind her back and leaving his wife like none the wiser. But the reason why this was a big deal is because of the legitimacy of children, right? So like if Katherine was still having an affair with Durham, or if she was having an affair with someone else, Henry didn't know about Culpeper at this point, but if she was having an affair with Culpeper and she would become pregnant and it were to be found out that, you know, this child may be illegitimate, then there could be issues. So if you remember when we talked about Catherine of Aragon, like Isabella of Castile had this whole thing where she inherited the throne because there were legitimacy questions between the person that she inherited it from and all of that. And it caused this like giant fucking war. So if something like that were to possibly happen in England, it could cause a giant fucking war, which I mean, already it kind of happens anyway, but we're going to do our best to like stop this from happening before it does. So there were all these just like questions of legitimacy, really. And that's why it was a big deal. And unfortunately, a man can get people pregnant and there's like no evidence of it on him, you know, like he doesn't have to walk around with a big pregnant belly that kind of like shows his like indiscretions, if that's what you want to call it or whatever. But, you know, a woman, she is like a walking poster of it when she is pregnant. I like had someone who told me that like there's nothing more sexual than a pregnant woman because she's just like walking very obviously, you know, that she's had sex. So yeah, anyway, so that was like the whole issue with it. It didn't matter. Men could sleep with as many women as they wanted to, especially if they were married already, because, you know, this is what Henry liked to do. But a woman could not have any extramarital affairs because, you know, the world is a terrible place and double standards are double standards. We love them. On November 6, 1541, Henry abandoned Catherine Howard at Hampton Court Palace while the investigations began into her possible infidelities and her past. During this time, it's reported that she refused to eat and drink, that she wept constantly to the point where like they took things away from her that they deemed she could commit suicide by. Like they were very, very worried about her. Not worried enough to actually like do anything to help her, but worried that she would kill herself before the investigation was complete. The next day on November 7th, 1541, Thomas Cranmer confronted Katherine, told her that she had been accused of committing adultery with Francis Derham, which scared the shit out of her, since what happened to her cousin Anne Boleyn, like, is probably like fucking fresh in her mind. Even though she was young when that happened, like, she probably knew about it. She heard word about it. She was probably surrounded by talk about it still. And it was reported that she burst into tears and became hysterical, and it was impossible to interrogate her. So Cranmer came back the next day after she had composed herself. He had reported to Henry VIII that he intended to interrogate her severely and harshly to like exaggerate the grievousness of her demerits, and then declare unto her the justice of your grace's laws, what she ought to suffer by the same. But when he saw how she was affected, he was worried that if he was too harsh towards her, that she might become hysterical again, and she might do something that couldn't be undone. So he told her that if she confessed, King Henry would probably show her mercy. So she did. She confessed. And it's reported that she told Cranmer, "Alas, my lord, that I am alive. The fear of death grieved me not so much before as doth now the remembrance of my king's goodness for me. When I remember how gracious and loving a prince I had, I cannot but sorrow. But the sudden mercy, and more than I could have looked for, showed me so unworthy at this time, maketh my defences to appear before mine eyes much more heinous than they did before. And the more I consider the greatness of his mercy, the more I do sorrow in my heart that I should misorder myself against his majesty." From there, she sat down and made a written confession of everything that happened. It began being examined by my Lord Canterbury of contracts and communications of marriage between Derham and me. I shall here answer faithfully and truly as I shall make answer at that last day of judgment. And by the promise that I had made in baptism and the sacrament that I received upon All Hallows days past. So she said that Derham and her exchanged small gifts, but never really exchanged anything significant like rings. If he had anything that he claimed he got from her, then he had stolen it. And some things that she had from him were taken, were things that he had left with her and wouldn't take back or hadn't taken back yet. There was $100 that was his savings that he left with her, which is something that husbands would do for their wives, but also not, I guess. She then went on to say that Derham had asked her to marry him multiple times and that she refused him, never officially said, "I promise you and I love you with all my heart," but she did tell him that she would never have another husband but him. He asked if he could call her wife, and she said that she was content with this, and she called him husband, and he kissed her often in public. But the way that she described it made it seem like she wasn't totally serious about it. She talks about winking and being a little evasive about it. She said that he would come to see her at night and bring wine, strawberries, and apples, and that he would make her happy, and that they slept together. She said, quote, "As for carnal knowledge, I confess as I did before, the diverse times he hath lain with me, sometimes in his doublet and hose, and 2 or 3 times naked. But not so naked that he had nothing upon him, for he always had at least his doublet. And as I do think his hose, but also, I mean, naked were his hose pulled down." She addressed some rumors, like how he was the one who would steal the keys and let him in. And that when it was decided that she would go to court, there was this rumor that she cried and didn't want to leave him, when that wasn't the case at all. He was in Ireland at that point. And also she very much wanted to go to court, and she broke up with him. And this could be confirmed when he wrote her a letter asking if she was getting married to Thomas Culpeper, because before she got in a relationship with the king, there were rumors that she was going to marry Thomas Culpeper. And she responded, "What should you trouble me therewith? For you know that I will not have you." So she was very much just not interested at all. So she wrote a second letter as well that day that begged Henry for mercy. It's actually really sad. At the beginning it says, "And where no cause of mercy is given on my part, most humble on my hands and knees, do desire one particle thereof to be extended unto me. Although all other creatures I am most unworthy either to be called your wife or subject. My sorrow I can by no writing express. Nevertheless, I trust your most benign nature will have some respect unto my youth, my ignorance, my frailness, my humble confession, my faults, my plain declaration of the same, referring me wholly unto your grace's pity and mercy." She then talks about Mannix, and that he touched her in her secret parts of her body, and that Derham used her such sort as a man doth his wife many times, but that they had ended their relationship almost a year before he married Anne of Cleves, which means at this point it's been 2.5 or 3 years since she had anything with Derham. She ends a letter by asking Henry to consider the subtle persuasions of young men and the ignorance and frailness of young women. And that she was afraid that if she told him everything, that it would change the way that he saw her, and that she didn't think it was important because she was planning on only being faithful to him. And now that she's told him the whole truth, she hopes that he will regard her with goodness, pity, compassion, and mercy. After she wrote these letters, she was confined to her chamber at Hampton Court Palace, and her jewels were seized. And Henry read this letter and didn't immediately decide to execute her. He decided that she would be punished, but not killed for now, at least, while they continued their investigation. So he moved her to Sion House, which used to be a nunnery. She was there in modest chambers without much while they tried to, continue this investigation. Now, if it all happened a long time before they got married, like she was saying, then it was okay. It wasn't great for her, but as long as she wasn't actively being an adulteress, Henry could probably look past it because she was just so young and hot or whatever. But Cranmer was not happy with this. He didn't believe that it happened a long time ago. He thought that it was still happening. So later on in November, they went and arrested Derham and brought him to the Tower of London for questioning, where he was tortured into a confession. So he denied that he was still having an affair with Katherine, but he knew of a man that had her affections after she was done with him, and it was Thomas Culpeper. Katherine was said to have been involved with Thomas Culpeper both before her marriage and after, like we talked about. So maybe before her marriage, there was some interest there, but then it said that he broke up with her and he started pursuing another woman. But then when he got sick and she was sending him meals and sending him gifts and all of that, that it sort of like may have reignited their relationship. And, you know, like I said, in the summer of 1541, they could have been meeting secretly while they were traveling across England. So right after this, they searched Culpeper's belongings and found a letter from Katherine. And this letter read, quote, "Master Culpeper, I heartily recommend me unto you, praying you to send me word how that you do. It was showed me that you were sick, the which thing troubled me very much till such time that I hear from you, praying you to send me word how that you do. For I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you and to speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now. That which doth comfort me much when I think of it, and when I think again that you shall depart from me, it makes my heart die to think what fortune I have that I cannot always be in your company. Yet my trust is always in you, that you will be as you have promised me, and in the hope I trust upon, praying that you will come when my Lady Rochford is here, for then I shall be best at leisure to be at your commandment. Thanking you for that which you have promised me to be so good unto the poor fellow, my man, which is one of the griefs that I do feel to depart from him. For then I do know no one that I dare trust to send you, and therefore I pray you to take him be with you, that I may sometime hear from you one thing. I pray you give me a horse for my man, who I had much ado to get one, and therefore I pray send me one by him, and in doing so I am set of 4. And thus I take my leave of you, trusting to see you shortly again. I would you was with me now, that you might see what pain I take in writing you. Signed, yours as long as life endures, Katherine." And this letter was as good as a death warrant. This letter didn't say explicitly that they were having sex, so maybe they could argue that they were just good friends, or maybe that there was romantic attraction, but there was nothing physical yet. But I mean, that is heavy love language, right? I mean, she says that her heart dies with the thought of not seeing him again. There are clearly really, really strong feelings there. So Thomas Culpeper was immediately arrested. He denied having sex with the Queen, but confessed that he intended and meant to do ill with the Queen, and likewise the Queen did with him. So this was basically just an admission that they wanted to have sex, but they didn't actually do it yet. Didn't elaborate in the sources that I read. So maybe because Henry was 50 at this point, and life expectancy was 40, maybe they were hoping that when the king died they could get married, but they weren't going to say it because remember what happened with Anne Boleyn. But maybe that was their intention, that they weren't going to have sex, but whenever the king died they would get married. Or maybe they were planning on having an extramarital affair, but there was no evidence of this. They both claimed that they didn't do anything. They both claimed that they weren't having an affair. And they hoped that this would mean mercy for them. And it didn't. The intent was enough. On December 1st, 1541, Culpeper and Derham were both brought to trial. They were found guilty of high treason and were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. They were both executed 9 days later on December 10th, 1541. Culpeper, because he was more of a nobleman and was very high in society and was relatively respected before his downfall, was beheaded instead of the original sentencing because that was a mercy on him. But Derham was subjected to the original sentencing. And I don't think people realize how horrific of a death that is, being drawn and quartered. It often consists of the person being dragged alive behind a horse before being hanged, but not to death, and then disemboweled alive. Then their entrails are burned in front of them while they're bleeding out. Then they are beheaded and quartered, which typically consisted of tying the remaining limbs to horses and then having those horses run in different directions to physically rip the body apart. And then typically those body parts are then displayed throughout the city to remind people what happens when you commit treason. It's horrific, which is why beheading is a mercy. I don't know about Derham's body parts, but his head was later put on a spike on London Bridge along with Culpeper's. And like they were still there into 1546. This was able to be done because the heads, before they were like put on spikes, were dipped in tar to preserve them and stop them from being eaten by birds and other scavengers. And if it started to smell, all the heads that were on London Bridge, the keeper would just like knock it off into the water. Apparently Derham and Culpeper did not start to smell too badly because, again, there are people who remarked that in 1546 their heads were still on pikes on London Bridge, like 5 years after their execution. Right before their execution on November 23rd, 1541, Katherine Howard was stripped of her crown, but her marriage to Henry VIII was never officially annulled, so she was still queen when she was executed. On December 22nd, 1541, members of the Howard and Tilney family were indicted for misprision of treason for covering up Catherine's affairs while she lived with the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. And they were all found guilty and sentenced to perpetual imprisonment and loss of goods. Katherine was denied a trial in court and the possibility to defend herself, and she was found guilty of treason, largely due to a brand new act called the Royal Assent by Commission Act of 1541, which made it treason for a queen consort to not disclose their sexual history within 20 days of marriage and to commit adultery while married. On February 10th, Katherine was taken from Sion House to the Tower of London by boat and was taken right past London Bridge with the heads of her former lovers who had been executed a few months beforehand. So that is just like psychological torture to see that as she is taken by. The night before her execution, Katherine asked for the execution block to be brought into her cell. She apparently wanted to make a good impression on the scaffold and to die with dignity, and she spent the night with what would be the last thing she ever saw and practiced. Eustace Shapley wrote about this. He said on Sunday the 12th toward evening, she was told to prepare for her death, for she was to die the next day. And that evening she asked to have the block brought into her that she might know how to place herself, which was done, and she made trial of it. On February 13th, 1542, Katherine Howard was executed after a bill of attainder was passed on the 21st of January, which was the bill that made it so she didn't have to go to trial and receive the death penalty. She was executed with Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, who was the wife of Anne Boleyn's brother George. She was being accused with helping, Jane did not confess to taking down the Boleyn siblings. That is a myth. It was probably originated with Gregorio Leti, who was an Italian historian who lived in the mid-1600s. He also wrote a lot of satire, was known for like making up stories and inflating things. And then, of course, The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory, just really pushes that Jane Boleyn had like a really big part in the downfall because she was just being like a petty wife or whatever. So unlike what the Tudors show, Jane was not executed first. Katherine was actually executed first because of her higher status. So Jane, when she was being executed, Shapley wrote that the Lady Rochford was brought who had shown symptoms of madness till they told her that she must die. Neither she nor the Queen spoke much on the scaffold. They only confessed their guilt and prayed for the king's welfare. Marillac, the French ambassador, said that the Lady Rochford said as much in a long discourse of several faults which she had committed in her life. Marillac was not there, but that might be where that idea that when she was executed, she confessed to bringing down the Boleyn siblings. That's probably where that originated from. But again, Marillac was not there. He heard secondhand. The people that actually were there did not corroborate his story. So Marillac, his full name is Charles de Marillac. He was a French ambassador to Francis I. He said that Queen Katherine was executed around 9 a.m. and that the Queen was so weak that she could hardly speak, but confessed in a few words that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the king. who had so graciously treated her. But again, he was not there. We do have someone who was there. His name was Otwell Johnson. He was a merchant, and he said something very different. So he wrote, "And for the news from hence, know ye that even according to my writing on Sunday last, I see the Queen and the Lady Rochford suffer within the Tower the day following, whose souls I doubt not be with God, for they made the most godly Christians' end that ever was heard tell of, I think, since the world's creation, uttering their lively faith in the blood of Christ only, their wonderful patience and constancy to the death, and with goodly words and steadfast countenance, they desired all Christian people to take regard unto their worthy and just punishment with death, for their offences against God heinously from their youth upward, and breaking of all of his commandments, and also against the king's royal majesty very dangerously. Whereof they, being justly condemned, as they said, by the laws of the realm and parliament, to die, required the people, I say, to take example at them for amendment of their ungodly lives, and gladly obey the king in all things, for whose preservation they did heartily pray, and willed all people to so do, commending their souls to God, and earnestly calling for mercy upon him, who I beseech to give us grace with such faith, hope, charity, at our departing of this miserable world, to come to the fruition of his Godhead in joy everlasting. Amen." So he said that Katherine and Jane were both very composed. They said the words that they needed to say. They did what they needed to do. And this was so, like, you had to pretty much do that, because even if you didn't have any children, you had family. And all of the last words were reported to Henry VIII. And if you said something negative, if you shit talked him before you were beheaded, then he would go after your family. And it was really, really terrible. Also, unlike what's portrayed in the Tudors and all of that, Katherine did not say, "I die a queen, but would rather die wife of Culpeper." That's not historically accurate at all. She just said what Otwell said that she said, and then she forgave the executioner and paid him a gold sovereign, as was custom, and then she did as she practiced. And she kneeled at the scaffold and placed her head upon the executioner's block and was beheaded, and Jane Boleyn followed right after. This time, Henry's wife was executed by axe, unlike his last wife, who was killed by the sword. But thankfully, and I suppose mercifully for Katherine Howard and Jane Boleyn, the executioner didn't do what happened with Cromwell, and it was just a single swing. Catherine's body, along with Lady Rochford's, was taken to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, which was also where Anne Boleyn was buried. When the chapel was restored during Queen Victoria's reign, her body was not one of the ones that was identified. Anne Boleyn's was identified, but George Boleyn wasn't, who was supposedly buried right next to her. And they also couldn't find the remains of Katherine Howard, because it said that the grounds were most likely disturbed in the 1700s and remains were removed, which is super disrespectful. So Katherine Howard may or may not be buried there. If you go visit the chapel today, you can pay your respects to her, and that's it. Katherine Howard is really only talked about like this. Her sexual exploits is all that's focused on. I could find very little about her actual life and who she was outside of a child who was raised without parents and parental influence and guidance in a hypersexual environment with men, not other children, but men who took advantage of her, and then went to another hypersexual environment at court where another man that was almost triple her age took advantage of her and then killed her for it. And it is so frustrating, and it is so sad. And there are so many historians who like to slut shame Katherine Howard for this, because she had sex with one person before she got married. The evidence says that she fooled around with Mannix when she was fucking 12, and then when she was 15 or 16 she had sex with Denham, and she was interested in Culpeper, but they both said that they never actually did anything. So she had sex with one person and was executed for it. And tell me how women are not punished for their sexual lives, and that this law that tried to control the sexuality of the wives of the kings and princes literally made it treason and an executable offense to cheat on them when kings and princes had as many fucking mistresses as they wanted. And not much has changed, has it? Where women are punished for their sexuality, and women are punished for having sex. In over almost 500 years, we haven't changed fucking at all, right? But you still have historians who say that, like, women's history and feminist history and like saying that women have been treated like shit historically, and that the way that we're treated now is like nothing new to how we've been treated, is just like inflated, and it's like not justified, and it has no grounds, and women are just like being dramatic and hysterical, and like we must just all be on our periods or whatever. But I mean, you had a child that was beheaded for having sex in England in 1542. And today there are women who are still being punished, and Roe versus Wade is trying to be overturned. So not much has changed. On that bombshell of a happiness, that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening today. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up, and stop fucking slut shaming Katherine Howard. I swear, if I read or hear another fucking historian slut shaming her for having sex, I will fucking riot. I am already like 2 seconds away from fucking rioting with the current political nightmare that is the United States. Like, I'm just looking for a reason. I wish a motherfucker would. All right, bye.